morning, we want to make a case for truth. And actually, I was thinking about it. Last night, kind of in our role play, it was fun and it was challenging. But often, your challenges will maybe not be that strong. If you actually look at kind of the population of atheists in the United States, it's not a big population. So often, you're not going to maybe necessarily engage with an atheist who's going to kind of come directly at your arguments. Oftentimes, much more often, you will engage with people who have been saturated in relativism. I was doing some graduate study at Denver Seminary a number of years ago, and one of the classes I had, I was given a project by my professor. And in this project, we were supposed to find someone who was not a believer and do an interview with them. And our professor gave us this list of different questions. And we were going to interview them about their different religious beliefs and moral beliefs and spiritual beliefs. And so we sit down for about an hour. And so I was doing college ministry at the time at my church. And one of my college students said he had a roommate who he had a lot of dialogue with, who was not a believer, but really intelligent. And he said he would be a great candidate. So he set up this opportunity for me to go interview his roommate. Now, they were both students at the University of Denver. And so I went to the University of Denver's campus and went up into this dorm room. And it was later at night. This college student wanted to meet at after his night class. And so I went up there. I probably got to his dorm room about 9:30 p.m. and knocked on his dorm. And he opened up. His name was Jordan. He introduced himself, and he invited me into the dorm room. So it was Jordan and I sitting in the dorm room doing this interview. And of course, I walked in and started looking at his dorm room. It's kind of your typical dorm where his bed and his dresser and his desk were on one side of the room. His roommate's bed and dresser and desk were on the other side of the room. And he had, books and all that stuff. But as I walked in and sat down, I noticed something interesting about Jordan's side of the room. He had it decorated with these really kind of ornate swords, like these really fancy kind of samurai swords that were hanging on the wall. So anyway, he pulls two chairs together, we sit down, I start interviewing him. I start asking him different questions about what his views are and things, and we got to the topic of morality. And we started talking about morality. I asked him, Jordan, do you think morality is objective or is it subjective? And he was very firm. He said, no, morality is subjective. Clearly, it's subjective. And so I wanted to kind of follow up with him and kind of press him on that a little bit and see kind of if he would be consistent on that. And so I said, well, what would you think if you got a phone call right now and it was the police and they had discovered your mom, and she had been, brutally tortured and killed? Wouldn't you say that was something that was not subjectively wrong, but objectively wrong, right? And so I'm offering what we call a clear case example here. And I remember Jordan looking at me, and with all seriousness, he said, I wouldn't like that, but I could not say that it's wrong. I could not say that that's objectively wrong. And so we explored that a little bit more. I said, well, why not? He said, because each culture determines its own morality. Each culture determines its own moral system. So it's completely dependent upon the culture and the people in that culture to determine what's right and wrong for them. And then he went on to kind of illustrate this for me. He said, I could imagine, Brett, a culture that has decided that when you see your best friend walking down the street, the thing that you should do is not wave and say hi to them, but in that culture, they've decided the best thing to do is to try and attempt to kill them. And that would just be what they determined was moral. I can imagine a culture like that. Now, just pause and think about what this seemingly bright, intelligent college student is arguing for. And then think about the situation I'm in. I'm sitting there. By this time, it's probably, 11 or so at night. I'm sitting there alone in a dorm room with a college student who's arguing for this, and there are swords hanging on the wall, right? So I quickly ended the interview and left. But I remember reflecting on that interview with that college student, Jordan, and thinking about the question, what would cause a student, again, the University of Denver was had high academic requirements. These are supposed to be pretty, really, intelligent students. Well, what would make an intelligent student affirm the kind of views that Jordan was affirming? And I realized it is the power of an idea. It's the power of an idea, and the idea is moral relativism. Moral relativism. Moral relativism is simply the view that there are no objective moral truths. Moral truths are relative to a subject, an individual, or relative to a culture. Right? So there's no objective moral truths that are true whether anyone believes them or not. Instead, you do your own thing. When it comes to morality, you determine it, or your culture determines it, and you do your own thing. That's the view. And so when you think back to that conversation with Jordan, Jordan was just trying to be consistent, wasn't he? He was just trying to hold consistency in his view. If he held that morality was simply determined by the culture, then yes, it actually makes sense that he can imagine a culture where you kill your best friends instead of saying hi to them. He was trying to be consistent. And this is the dominant view in the U.S. It's the dominant view in the West. In fact, in 1987, Alan Bloom, who was a professor, wrote a book called The Closing of the American Mind. And this is how he opened the first chapter. He said, there's one thing a professor can be absolutely sure of. Almost every student entering the university believes or says he believes that truth is relative. The students, of course, cannot defend their opinion. It is something with which they have been indoctrinated. 20 years later, this hasn't changed. In fact, I would argue it's probably gotten worse. This book, Soul Searching, is a major study done on the spiritual and religious lives of American teenagers. This is, I think, a fantastic book if you really want to get a sense for where our young people are at. But in this book, researcher Christian Smith says this is kind of a summary of some of the things they found. They said American youth, like American adults, are nearly without exception profoundly individualistic. The typical bywords are, who am I to judge? If that's what they choose, whatever. Each person decides for himself, and if it works for them, fine. And what they found was that relativism was the dominant assumed viewpoint of American young people. And you even see it spilling over into all areas of life. Now, let me make a distinction for you to help you understand this. The distinction between what we'd say subjective truth and objective truth. And I want to give you an analogy that would kind of help hang this idea for you. But when you think of ice cream and how you approach ice cream, that illustrates the nature of subjective truth. And so if I say to you, Reese's peanut butter cup ice cream is delicious. How many of you would say that statement's true? Raise your hand if you say that statement's true. Okay. I noticed not everyone raised their hand. If you think that statement's false, raise your hand. Okay, thank you for being honest. I think we have Bibles for these folks afterwards. Now look, I love Reese's peanut butter cup ice cream, all right? I could eat it every single day. But we would say, when it comes to ice cream flavors, that flavor is my favorite flavor, but it may not be yours, and that's okay. So the statement, Reese's peanut butter cup ice cream is delicious, is true for me, even if it may not be true for you, right? This is a subjective claim. Think of the word subjective. The word subjective contains the word subject. So a subjective truth is something that's true for the subject, true for the individual. It means the truth is relative to the individual or to the subject. Okay, that's subjective truth. Objective truth is very different. And what I want you to do is I want you to think of medicine. Think about how you approach medicine. I hope that you approach medicine differently than you approach your ice cream flavors, right? When it comes to ice cream, we choose what we like. We choose what's true for us. But when it comes to medicine, we choose what's true, period, right? You don't approach medicine with your likes and your dislikes. Imagine you're diagnosed with a disease and the doctor says, here's the good news, we have the cure here, take this and you'll get better. How many of us look at the doctor and say, okay, well, what are the other options? That doesn't look like it tastes very good, doctor. I don't think I want that. Right? No, of course not. Of course not, because we know that there are objective truths, things that are true whether we believe them or not. So here are kind of two key words to help us make this distinction. Subjective truth has to do with our personal preferences, right? It has to do with me, the subject, and what I believe. But objective truths are not dependent upon what I believe. They're true whether I believe them or not, and so that's where we use the word fact. There are facts that are true, and it doesn't matter if you deny them, right? So this is the distinction. So let's do a test now. Let's test ourselves on this distinction. And I'm going to put up a claim, and when I put up the claim, you just simply identify if the claim is an objective claim or a subjective claim, right? So if I said, oh, look, that guy's shirt is red. Is that objective or subjective? That's an objective claim. Notice it's a claim about the object. And it doesn't matter what my opinion is. It doesn't matter what my perception is. The shirt is either red or it's not. So now what if I said, well, red is the best color? Yeah, there's a subjective claim, right? Now that's not about the object, that's about me. That's about the subject. 2 + 2 = 4. That's an objective claim, okay? If you want to claim that mathematics is subjective, just take that to your math class and see how that works out. Tropical island vacations are the best kind. It's a subjective claim, right? That's grounded in the preferences of a subject. What if I said, Brett can bench press 350 pounds? Let me clarify that this is not a true or false test. So when you say false or lie, that's the wrong answer, okay? Now, is this an objective claim or a subjective claim? So there's a little confusion here. What is the claim about? The claim is about an act that I can do, bench pressing 350 pounds. That is not about me and my personal preferences. It doesn't matter what I believe about the matter. That is an objective claim. So here's a good clarification. Objective claims are either true or false. So something can be objectively true or objectively false. But right now, all I want you to do is identify whether or not it's an objective claim or a subjective claim. Now, you don't know if it's objectively true or objectively false at this point. Apparently, some of you believe it's objectively false because you're apparently not convinced by my massive physique. So, now, notice, but the proving it is a different issue, isn't it? So this is true or false, whether I can prove it or not. So true or false does not depend on our ability to prove it. And I think that's a helpful insight because when you engage with somebody who's maybe skeptical and challenges you and maybe you stumble, that's okay. It's okay to admit that you don't know, but realize God's existence, the resurrection of Jesus, the trustworthiness of God's word is not, the facts are not dependent upon your ability to prove them. So God's word stands whether or not you can defend it well or not. Now, of course, we should get better at defending it, right? But those things are true whether we believe them or not. And so this would be a claim we'd say, okay, well, prove it, Brett. So then we would go down to the gym, we put 350 pounds on the bench press, and boom, I'll show you what's up. I'll show you that the claim is clearly false, okay? And you would be convinced that is objectively false. All right, but it's an objective claim. 6, atoms consist of protons, neutrons, and electrons. It's an objective claim. How about this one? Number 7, God exists. Objective or subjective? How many say objective? How many say subjective? Okay, all right. What if I said this? Jesus is the only way to God, and Orthodox Jews are wrong about him. Objective or subjective? Objective? Subjective? Okay, I'm hearing a little more disagreement here. All right. Okay, how about I put this claim up? Premarital sex is morally wrong. Objective or subjective? Objective? Subjective? Okay. It is wrong for women to have an elective abortion. Objective or subjective? Okay. Now, I noticed that it got a lot quieter with those last 4 claims. There seemed to be either some disagreement or it could just a lack of confidence in our ability to identify whether these are objective or subjective claims. Now, it was interesting in here, many of you said that 7, 8, 9, and 10 were objective, definitely the majority. And I'll tell you that when I give this test, and particularly when I give this test amongst young people, it's not the case. In fact, usually when I get to claim 7 and say God exists, that's where I'll see a split in the room. Some will say objectives, but many will say subjective. And then when I lay out the claim number 8, many young people will say, no, that's subjective. And then I get to 9 and 10, and I would say 80, 90% of the young people in the room, whether they're Christians or not, will argue that those things are subjective. But I would agree with the majority of you that 7, 8, 9, and 10 are objective claims. Right? And think about it. What is the claim about? The claim is about an object. So if I say God exists, I'm making a claim about an object outside of myself. It's like saying the podium exists. That's the same kind of claim. Is the podium's existence dependent upon what I believe about it? No, it has nothing to do with my preference. So it's not a subjective claim. Now, the claim that the podium exists is either true or false, though. And the claim that God exists is either true or false. So someone may disagree with us on the claim that God exists, but I want to just get clear on the nature of the claim. It's an objective claim. All right? And the same thing with number 8. 8 is about Jesus. What is the nature of Jesus? What has he accomplished? That's an objective claim. Now it's either true or false. Of course, I will argue that claim is true. That's what we know to be true, okay? But it's an objective claim. 9 and 10 are objective claims about the nature of some particular action. But I want you to notice what happens in our culture typically when we get to claims like 7, 8, 9, and 10. Now think about what happened. Well, why did we, even in this room, maybe lose some confidence? Because when we went through 1 through 6, there wasn't the hesitation. But 7, 8, 9, and 10, definitely we were more hesitant. So why is that? Well, think about the categories that we switched over to. 7 and 8 are examples of what kind of claims? Religious claims, right? Those are religious claims. 9 and 10, what kind of claims? Moral claims. And what has happened in our culture, because of this relativism that we've been so socialized by, it's relativized in particular our religious and moral views. So that we don't think, most Americans do not think, that you can have religious or moral knowledge anymore. And I think the lack of confidence on our part shows how we've been chipped away at, how we've been influenced by it. Even though we were able to say it's objective, we were hesitant. And then the question is, how do we defend that? Can we really offer the reasoning for that case? And so I want you to see how you and I are influenced by the culture and how our young people are just saturated in this kind of relativism. And there's huge consequences. Think about the young person who holds views that there are objective moral truths and are firmly grounded in that, and some student who thinks that morality is simply dependent upon your whims or your preferences. The student who thinks that there are objective moral truths understands that morality doesn't change when there's pressure, peer pressure. Morality doesn't change even if you desire something. And that objective morality ends up being able to, having a strong view of objective morality is able to anchor the moral life for that student and their moral decisions. Versus the student who thinks it's all subjective. And that it can simply change if I desire it. And when there's pressure, you're not certainly going to have the kind of backbone to stand up against that. So there are huge implications. Ideas have consequences. Ideas have tremendous consequences. So that's why it's so important for us to think carefully about these particular ideas, okay? All right, so here's what I want to do now. I want to move and start thinking about how we know morality, okay? How do we know the difference between right and wrong? So here's what I want you to do. I want you to take 2 minutes. I want you to turn to your neighbor, and I want you to answer this question, all right? Turn to a neighbor, have a little discussion, answer this question, ready, go. Okay, I'm sure there was probably some discussion about how we learn morality through what we're taught, through our culture, maybe through our parenting, our family system. That's one way that we come to learn and recognize the difference between right and wrong. Through experience, kind of trial and error, that's certainly a way. But maybe some of you talked about conscience, or talked about something that's kind of built in that allows us to recognize morality, and that's what I want to talk about. In fact, I want to give you an analogy to help you understand what we're going to talk about. Think about, how do you not recognize the difference between right and wrong, but how do you recognize when a physical object is in front of you? You and I have what is called sense perception, right? Sense perception, so our senses, our ability to see, our ability to hear, our ability to feel, right? These are what we call our these are our senses that allow us to perceive what's out there in the world, right? It's real basic. And so, how do I know there's a podium in front of me? Well, I can see it, and I can feel it, and my sense perception delivers immediately to me the truth that there's a podium in front of me, right? And so notice, I don't have to reason through, I don't have to come up with some kind of like syllogism to know that there's a podium in front of me. Instead, my senses deliver the truth of that immediately to me. There's kind of a self-evident nature to it, right? I just see it and I realize it's there. Now, is it possible for someone to come in here and to deny the existence of the podium? Yeah, of course. Someone could say, well, there is really no podium there. That it's possible that there is no podium in front of you. That it's possible that this is just an illusion. And of course, as Jim made the distinction last night, we're not interested in what's possible. We want to know what's reasonable. And so if somebody comes in and says, hey, Brett, there's actually no podium right there. Should I join them in their skepticism, or should I be skeptical of their skepticism? I think I should be skeptical. Now think about how this conversation would go, though. Someone comes in and they truly want to deny the existence of the podium. Well, what would I do if I really thought that they were denying the existence of the podium and they really believed that there was no podium? What would I do to try to convince them that the podium is really here? I would probably just say, look, all right? Open your eyes. Like, look again. No, you don't see what I see right here in front of me. And so I would simply point to that thing again so that to see if their senses are working. And if their senses aren't able to tell them that the podium is here, I don't start questioning whether the podium's there. I question their ability to sense the podium. Make sense? And so it's not, I shouldn't be skeptical of my ability to see simply because they can't see. In the same way, we have moral perception. We have moral perception. And the way philosophers talk about it is that we have moral intuitions. So this is the term, moral intuitions. And intuition is, we're not talking about like a woman's intuition, right? Where I don't know, my wife, my mother, the women in my lives have this ability to just have this gut feeling, you know? Like we walk into a room, they meet somebody, they're like, that's a bad person. I'm like, what do you mean that's a bad person? I can hang out with that guy, all right? And I'm not talking about that. By intuition, here's how you define intuition. Intuition is a reflective way of seeing something. It's a reflective way of seeing something. That means you reflect, and after a moment's reflection, you simply come to see the truth of the matter. These are things that we might say are obvious, or they're common sense. We simply reflect, and we just come to the truth of it. And now think about it. We have a famous document in the history of the United States that actually appeals to our moral perception. It is the Declaration of Independence, where these words are penned. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Think about that. There are truths that are self-evident. What are those truths? That all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. So what truths are self-evident? Moral truths about the nature of human beings. And the founders even built this into the Declaration. This is a very key part of their argument, right? There are these moral truths that are self-evident, they're being violated, so we're justified in taking action. And so that's the idea of moral intuitions. Moral intuitions help us to recognize truths that are self-evident. Now, this is consistent with the teaching of Scripture, isn't it? If you look in Romans chapter 2, Paul says this. He says, for when Gentiles who do not have the law do instinctively the things of the law, these not having the law are a law to themselves, and that they show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience bearing witness, and their thoughts alternately accusing or else defending them. So what is Paul saying? Paul is saying, whether you're a Jew or a Gentile, whether you have the revealed law or not, you have the ability to know moral truth. Why? Because God has written it on every single human heart. And so this is what we sometimes refer to it in different ways, but one of the terms that we use is a conscience. Conscience, this is the idea that there's something built into humanity. There is a moral perception that's built into us for us to be able to recognize moral truth. Just like your sense perception tells you about the nature of physical reality around you, your moral perception tells you about the nature of moral reality around you. In fact, Jay Budiszewski, who's a really good thinker, wrote a book. I love the title of the book. He says, "What we can't not know." We can deny it, but we can't not know it. There's a difference, isn't there? And God's moral law is written on every single human heart. Now, sometimes it's buried. Sometimes we suppress it, right? Romans 1 tells us that we suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Notice the connection between the suppression of truth and morality. And so we might suppress truth, we might deny truth, but moral truth is something we can't not know because it's written on every human heart. Okay? Now, how does this work? Well, oftentimes we can just see something and know the moral status of that action. So let me give you an example. God has blessed me with 5 kids. I have 5 wonderful kids, 3 daughters, 2 boys. And but one thing as soon as my daughters were born, I grew up in a home with all boys. And so getting married to a woman was a big enough adjustment for me. And then having girls, I never thought God would do that. And he has certainly used that to, shave off a lot of my rough edges. But so as I've had girls, I realize eventually these girls, they grow up and they eventually want to leave your house. And, I don't want that to happen, but then I know that, one day they're probably going to, find a guy that they, like and fall in love and all that bad stuff. So I thought I've really got options here. I can either chain them to the water heater in our basement for the rest of their lives, or I can try to prepare them for that, right? So I've opted to try and prepare them for that day when, they're, whether they go on their first date or whatever, they get into a relationship. So one of the things I do with my girls is I take them on dates, right? Daddy-daughter dates, and we'll just spend time together, and I'll just try to model for them how they're supposed to be treated. So that's what they come to expect, all right? But so we go on daddy-daughter dates, and always our daddy-daughter dates end up at an ice cream place. We'll go to a movie, and then we go to ice cream, or we go to the park, and then we're going to ice cream. And I remember one particular date with my oldest daughter, Lexi. We had gone to a movie, and then we ended up going to an ice cream place. This is when we lived in Colorado. We went to a Dairy Queen, right? There's Dairy Queens here in Tennessee. Okay. I didn't know if they were all over the nation. I assumed they were. So I love Dairy Queen, right? So we go to Dairy Queen, and this particular Dairy Queen had the order line. So there's a little sign above the cash register, order here. And then down the way a little bit, there was the pickup section, pick up here. So we get in line. There's a couple people in front of us. And so Lexi and I are standing there. We're chatting. We're talking. But, as you're standing there, you just kind of casually observe, the people around you. And I noticed that there was a mom and her son who were standing right in front of us. And as I'm observing them, I noticed that the son, he looks like he's like 14 or 15 years old. But he has some kind of physical disability. I'm not sure exactly what it was, but his left arm, he kept kind of like this, and was kind of up against his body. He didn't seem to have full motion with his arm, and his hand looked a little bent. And then when he walked, his left side, he walked with a limp. So he would kind of limp. And so I'm observing him and his mom and how they're interacting and just kind of looking around. But then I hear this student, this high school boy, I hear him call out a name. And I look up, right? And he's looking kind of across the restaurant. He apparently sees someone he recognizes. And so he says, "Hey, Mike." And then he starts to limp over towards Mike, and he's kind of dragging himself over there to see Mike, this guy who he apparently recognized. So I just kind of naturally turn and look over and see Mike. And I remember watching Mike, and I remember seeing Mike hear his name called, and then he kind of glances over, right? So he looks over, and he sees this handicapped kid walking towards him. And I remember Mike's face. It kind of dropped. And you just kind of see him roll his eyes and like, oh, I do not want to be seen with that kid. Right? It looked like he was another high schooler or something. So you see his face drop, and then I watch Mike just kind of give the heads up, and then just like turned away. And then I watched this boy with the who was walking over. I watched him stop. And he got the message loud and clear. Like just the body language was loud and clear. And I remember he stopped kind of midway on his way over to go see Mike and talk with Mike. And I remember he stopped and he paused. And then I heard him say, oh, it's all good. It's all good. And then he limped back over and then he just stood by his mom. And I just saw that unfold in front of me. And you know what? I did not need anybody to come up behind me and whisper in my ear and go, Brett, did you see that? Did you know that that's wrong to treat other human beings that way? No one had to tell that to me. I simply saw it, reflected on it, and it was immediately obvious to me that that was morally wrong. That is not the way that you treat other human beings. And I remember inside of me, it's like something is rising up inside of me, right? And of course, I want to go over to this Mike guy and have a conversation with him. What are you thinking, Mike? Do you know what you just communicated to that kid? Do you know what you communicated about his value and his worth? You just basically communicated to him that he is not worth your time, that he's a piece of trash, right? I wanted to read him the riot act. But I noticed by just seeing this unfold in front of me, something was dredged up. And I think this whole concept makes sense of it. There is a moral perception. There are moral intuitions that are our ability to know moral truth. Just like you can see the podium. Just when your moral senses are when your sense perception is working well, you can see the podium. In the same way, when your moral perception is working well, you can see certain things that are self-evident, okay? Now, we live in a culture that has given us so much moral skepticism that when I make this kind of claim, it's really hard for people to believe. So what I'm trying to do is overcome in us that moral skepticism. If someone came to me and said, well, it may be justified for him to treat, people with disabilities that way, or it's okay to treat some human beings as subhuman. If that's the claim, I should not then become skeptical of human dignity, okay? No, I want us to have confidence that God has built into every single human being, has written on our hearts his moral law such that we're able to recognize moral truth. And that when the skeptic comes and questions you on that you don't have to give in to that. But that you can confidently assert that there are things that are objectively right and objectively wrong. In fact, this is what provides a basis for just action. No wonder now in our culture we hear stories of people who simply stand around and watch evil perpetrated on other people. Because we no longer live in a culture where we have strong moral intuition, or our moral intuitions have not been conditioned in a way that we have strong moral convictions. And we hedge on right and wrong. And we lose our confidence. And I want to say we can have confidence. Just like I know this podium is here, I know there are certain moral truths that are clear. Now, let's clarify though. Not every single moral truth is self-evident. All I'm trying to do at this point is build a base from which we can work on. But there are certain moral truths that are self-evident. So let's take a true and false test here. True or false? Let's take my son, Jonah, when he was 18 months. It's objectively true that he was the cutest 18-month kid in the world. But let's say Jonah says it's wrong to torture young children for fun. Is that statement true or false? True. Some of you didn't answer. Makes me a little nervous. Please stay away from my children, okay? But hopefully you didn't answer because it's just so obvious, right? The claim, it is wrong to torture young children for fun, is true, okay? That's true. Now, is that a claim that someone can deny? Of course, you can deny anything. So someone might come and say, well, no, I could actually imagine maybe a culture where it is okay to torture children for the pure pleasure of it. And whatever scenario they give me, I'm going to look at them and say, no, I think you're wrong. Just because they're a moral skeptic doesn't mean I should change my position on that one. In fact, think about it. If I say that it's wrong to torture children for fun, and someone says, well, I don't necessarily believe that, how do I try to convince them of my position? I just say, look, again, right? I get them to try and look morally, if you will. I say, wait a second. You take a child, you torture them just for fun. That's wrong. So all I'm doing is kind of saying like, wait, take another look. And if they don't come to see the truth of that, I don't start saying, well, gosh, maybe I need to readjust my moral position. Or I don't look at them and go, oh, you must have some sophisticated moral view. No, the person who wants to deny that it's wrong to torture children for fun, I have 3 words for that person. Here they are. Get help now, okay? Get help now. Now, I'm not, obviously in a talk like this, I'm characterizing a certain way. I'm not gonna be rude, I'm not gonna be a jerk, I'm not gonna be arrogant. But I'm trying to make a strong point here. That if someone questions me on something like this, and they don't hold this view, the problem is not with the view, the problem is with them. There's something wrong with their moral perception. Just like if you are unable to see the podium, right? If a blind person who can't see the podium, we don't say, well, the podium's not there. We say there's something wrong with their senses, so they can't recognize the podium. That's what I'm saying here. And the person who wants to deny moral truths, you know, that something like this, torturing children for fun is wrong. If you deny that, I'm not sure you need an argument, right? That's where you might need therapy at that point. And so an argument, there's only so far I can go with you if you're going to deny such an obvious moral truth. True or false? Killing innocent people for no reason is wrong. True, okay? Raping women is morally good. False. We should practice racism daily. False, right? You should beat your siblings often. Okay. Now for high schoolers and junior hires, that's a little difficult. I mean, might not be as quite as self-evident as we hope. But the point here is that there are some basic, obvious moral truths that we can put out there and say, hey, look, these are obvious moral truths. In fact, what you discover is that kind of throughout cultures, there's been a core set of moral values that all cultures have come to recognize. Even if they play out a little bit differently in the culture, the moral principle undergirding action is the same. We see this kind of universally. In fact, at the end of C.S. Lewis's book, The Abolition of Man, he kind of documents this in one of his index. And so we see this. In fact, the atheist can agree with us on this point. Kai Nielsen is a very smart atheist. He's an atheist philosopher. He wrote a book called Ethics Without God. And in that, he talks about our ability to know moral truth. And he's referring to wife beating and child abuse, and this is what he says. It is more reasonable to believe such elemental things to be evil than to believe any skeptical theory that tells us we cannot know or reasonably believe any of these things to be evil. I firmly believe that this is bedrock and right, and that anyone who does not believe it cannot have probed deeply enough into the grounds of his moral belief. So even the atheist can agree that we have the ability to know moral truth, and if you don't recognize that, wife beating and child abuse are wrong, you simply haven't probed deeply enough into your moral beliefs. You have not thought and reflected enough. And when you reflect, these things can become self-evident. And so, what have we done here? We've tried to rebuild our confidence that we can know moral truth. that we can simply recognize obvious moral truths. And that's a good foundation, especially in this culture. And if we can recognize certain objective moral truths, that means morality is objective, it's not subjective. Okay? Now, let's keep building our case here. Let's take another step. Let's say the person wants to affirm moral relativism. Well, what we could also point out is that there are flaws in that way of thinking. So if morality turns out simply to be relative to an individual or a subject or a culture, here are a couple of problems. Number one, the relativist cannot complain about the problem of evil. Think about it. Relativism, the view that morality is relative, is inconsistent with the view that there is evil and suffering in the world. Let's play this out. I'm sure, how many of you have ever played organized sports before? Anyone play organized sports? Okay, a lot of us. How many of you have played actually the best sport out there in the world? Yeah, soccer. We've got soccer players. There we go. They knew it. They knew it. Soccer players. I played soccer all my life, okay? And in fact, as I've gotten older, I've been playing in adult leagues, and sadly, as I get older, my body is breaking down. But and you get these injuries. But just imagine I show up one Monday night for my men's adult soccer league, and typically you would show up, 10, 15 minutes early, we'd show up like half an hour early to warm up and that kind of thing. But let's say I show up and I get there like 5 minutes before the game. I barely have enough time to throw on my shin guards, my socks, my cleats, and get out on the field for the ref to blow his whistle and start the game. Well, what happens typically at the beginning of our games before we even start the game is the ref will bring both teams to the center circle. He'll lay out some rules, we'll shake hands, and then we'll go to our positions. So I miss all of that. But I get onto the field in time for the ref to blow his whistle, the game to start, and let's say a teammate of mine passes me the ball. Right? I collect the ball, I start dribbling, and someone from the opposite team, from my opponent, comes sliding in. They're going to slide tackle me, right? But instead of touching the ball, their cleats go right into the back of my calf, and I go down really hard. And when I get up, who am I looking for? Okay, some of you said, the guy, all right? If my moral intuitions aren't working well, I'm looking for the guy. Okay, but let me clarify. If I don't hear a whistle, who am I looking for? I'm looking for the ref. Because I notice I'm going to make an appeal, right? I'm going to say, ref, why didn't you blow a whistle? Why didn't you call a foul? Now imagine the ref looks back at me and says, oh, you're the player who missed the opening instructions. Oh, let me clarify. Both teams decided that in tonight's game of soccer, there were going to be no rules. There are no rules, but everyone gets to decide for themselves. So apparently, he decided that one of his rules was going to be taking people out by side tackling them. Who am I to judge? All right? Now think about it. If that were the case, then what happens to my appeal for a foul? Doesn't it become irrelevant? Yes, it becomes irrelevant because in a game with no rules, there are no fouls. In a game with no rules, there are no fouls. Now, apply that illustration to the universe. In a universe with no rules, there are no fouls. In a universe with no objective moral standards, there is no such thing as evil. Right? In fact, that is the appeal that many atheists want to make. This is the inconsistency you actually find in a lot of atheism. So this is Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins is maybe the most famous atheist in the world right now. Oxford biologist, famous evolutionist. One of his most famous books is called The God Delusion, right? And probably the most famous line in The God Delusion is this: the God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully. Okay? I just want to say, Richard, please don't hold back. Tell us what you really think. I mean, so what is Richard Dawkins saying here? Richard Dawkins is saying the God of the Bible is evil. The God of the Bible is evil. Now, of course, Richard Dawkins hasn't just written one book. He hasn't written just two books. He's written a number of books. So we have a very clear idea of what his views are. And actually, before he ever wrote The God Delusion, he wrote a book called River Out of Eden, where he laid out his views on cosmic evolution. And this is what he says. He says, in a universe of electrons and selfish genes, blind physical forces, and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt. Other people are going to get lucky. And you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Do you see the inconsistency between those two views? How can you argue that given this universe there's no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good, and then argue that the God of the Bible is an evil character? That's inconsistent. You can't have it both ways. One of the unique mission trips that I take young people on is what we call our Berkeley mission trip. It's an apologetics mission trip where we help teach young people to know what they believe and why they believe it. And so we decided, hey, where's the kind of the most radical place in the U.S. we can take them? So we take them to Berkeley. Berkeley is just a little bit different than Franklin, just a little bit, okay? And one of the things that we do is we will bring out people to challenge our young people in their beliefs. And so these are a couple of atheists that we have had come and speak to our students. In fact, David Fitzgerald is a friend of mine. I've been working with him for the last 11 years. He's an atheist activist in the Bay Area, and he comes and speaks to the students that we take on these trips every single time. And he will challenge them with atheistic views, and then we help them to see how Christianity holds up against these other worldviews. And we can take the fire away. We don't have to worry because what we believe is true. So anyway, these two guys, one of the first years we did this trip, Larry and David were giving a joint presentation. And this is a picture from that presentation. And they were arguing against God. And so they were laying out a number of different arguments. But one of the arguments that they offered, and particularly David in this presentation, was he was saying he could not believe in the God of the Bible because of all the horrible things that the God of the Bible commanded Israel and that kind of thing, right? And this is kind of a current objection that we need to deal with. But what I wanted to help him see is that his worldview didn't even allow him to raise the objection. And so he raises his objection. During the Q&A time, I said, David, can I ask you a clarification question? Do you think that morality is objective or subjective? So he clarified. He said, morality is subjective. And this is what he said. He said, each culture determines what's right and wrong for them. And so then I tried to gently point out the inconsistency. I said, well, David, okay, you are a 21st century American living in this culture in this time. But you are looking back on an ancient Israeli culture and saying that what they did is wrong. Isn't that consistent if morality is determined by each culture? Now, he saw the problem. He saw the problem. I remember he kind of looked up and like, okay, yeah, that's okay. All right, well, morality, I guess, is objective in some sense. And he had to kind of modify his view. Now, from the earlier presentation, I knew that Larry did not believe that, so I turned to Larry. I said, Larry, what do you think? Do you think morality is objective or subjective? And Larry said, oh, no, morality is subjective. Each person determines, it's based upon what you feel. And so each person determines that. I said, well, David, what do you think about that? And so then we let the atheists kind of debate it out. Okay. Because you see the inconsistency. You cannot say that God is evil, or you cannot say that there are bad things that happen unless you have, undergirding that, a view that there is an objective moral standard. In fact, C.S. Lewis, right, former atheist, he said, my argument against God was that the universe seemed to be cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with? when I called it unjust. You see the inconsistency. So if you want to be a consistent moral relativist, you cannot complain about the problem of evil. But here's flaw number 2. The relativists can't improve their morality. Or let's just put it this way, morality cannot be improved on their view. The idea of moral improvement is inconsistent for the relativist. Now think about it. Let me give you an analogy to help understand this. Take the game of bowling. All right, I'm sure most of us in here have gone bowling before, and in bowling we realize there's a scoring system. All right, is there a standard score, or is there a goal that we shoot for? Is there a perfect score in bowling? Yeah, okay, so it's 300. So 300 is the perfect score. Now think about it. If I start to bowl, and let's say I'm bowling, and the first game I bowl 100. How do I determine the second game, if I've improved or I've gotten worse? Well, I look at 100, and let's say the second game I bowl 150. I look at the score, don't I? And I realize that 150 is closer to the standard, 300, the perfect standard. 100 is not as close. And so I realize that 150 is a higher score, or 150 is improvement, isn't it? So I have bowling improvement because there's a standard by which I can measure my scores. In the same way, if there is no standard of morality, there's no way to determine moral improvement. There's no way that we can look at things in our society and say it's getting better or it's getting worse. You have to have a standard. In fact, this is illustrated beautifully by a comic written by Bill Watterson, Calvin and Hobbes. You got Calvin and Hobbes in one of their little philosophical conversations. Hobbes says this to Calvin. He says, "How are you doing on your New Year's resolutions?" Calvin says, "I didn't make any." See, in order to improve oneself, one must have some idea of what's good. That implies certain values. But as we all know, values are relative. Every system of belief is equally valid, and we need to tolerate diversity. Virtue isn't better than vice, it's just different. Hobbes says, "I don't know if I can tolerate that much tolerance. I refuse to be victimized by notions of virtuous behavior." All right? And he in a fun way, illustrates the inconsistency here. If there is no objective standard of morality, there's no such thing as moral improvement. But again, here's where our moral abilities come into play. Aren't there things that we look at and point to that just seem to be clear case examples of moral improvement in our culture? Right? So the elimination of slavery, civil rights, women's suffrage. These are clear examples of moral improvement. But the only thing that makes sense of moral improvement is if you have a moral standard at which you're aiming for. And when you get closer to the standard, you know you're making improvements. Here's the third flaw. The relativist cannot promote the obligation of tolerance. And this one is ironic because the relativist will say morality is relative, everyone has their own views, therefore you should be tolerant. This is the view that they promote all the time. Now, when I first joined Stand to Reason 13 years ago, I was given an opportunity to do a debate on the University of San Diego's campus with this guy, Dr. John Berteau. Okay, it was Brett Kunkle versus Dr. John Berteau. I had just started Stand to Reason. I had just started my master's program in philosophy. I had been a youth pastor for the previous 11 years, and now I'm going to go onto a college campus and debate a PhD in philosophy. Right? He was a teacher, he was a professor at San Diego State University, and the debate was at the University of San Diego. But our debate question favored me. Our debate question was, are there objective moral truths? I was arguing for the positive side, he was arguing for the negative side. And here's how Dr. John Berteau argued his case. He basically pointed to different moral views in different cultures. He gave us some examples of different moral views. And he said, look, this culture affirms something like this. This culture affirms this. This culture affirms this. These are different. And then he said, therefore, what we need to do is not impose our views on other people, think our views are right, but what we need to do is we need to be tolerant of other moral positions. So I got up, and all I did was at the beginning of my opening statement, my response is I rehearsed what he had said. Dr. John Berteau says there are no objective moral truths, no objective moral facts, because we have these differences from culture to culture. But then what did he say? He said, therefore, we should be tolerant. So I said, effectively, what he's argued is that there are no objective moral truths. Here's one: be tolerant, right? And that is it. So if he's right that we should be tolerant, then his position is false. Okay? Because you cannot argue that there's an obligation to be tolerant if there are no objective moral truths. I can only have an objective moral duty, or a moral duty, if there's an objective moral truth. And so you can't tell people they should be tolerant because you're giving them something that they should or ought to do, a moral truth, a moral obligation. That's inconsistent if morality turns out to be subjective, you see. And so those are just a few of the flaws with the moral relativist. Now, how do we engage maybe someone in just a kind of a normal conversation where you're not going to lay out some kind of academic kind of, response, right? Well, let me tell you the problems with your view. Flaw number one, you're just not going to do that. So how can you just kind of illustrate this for people in normal conversation? I think there's a couple of things you can do, right? Because I think at the end of the day, what you're going to want to help someone see, and you want to do this gently and respectfully, of course, but you're going to want to help them to see that they are not consistent relativists, they are selective relativists. So the first thing that you can do in a conversation with someone is just simply push a hot button. Okay? You just find out something that they care about, and then you relativize that. You relativize a position they hold firmly. So for instance, if my friend is let's say my friend is a strong environmentalist, right? They think we should protect the environment. I would agree. I think we are stewards of God's creation, right? So I might agree with that, but if I know they're a strong environmentalist, I may want to relativize their view to see if they can be a consistent moral relativist. So I might say, and so here be an example, right? I might say, hey, you know what? I'm going up to Big Bear Lake this weekend. I'm going up with some buddies. Want to know if you want to come with us. There's like 5 of us, and what we do is we all throw $50 into a pot beforehand. We go up, and Big Bear Lake, we rent a boat. We take the boat into the middle of the lake. We have this huge 50-gallon vat of acid, and we pour it into the lake. And we all take a guess beforehand, and whoever's guess comes closer to the truth wins the pot of money. And the guess is how many dead fish will rise to the surface. Want to join us, right? Now, obviously, I'm giving you a humorous example, but you see what I'm trying to do. I'm relativizing that position. Now, if my friend thinks that that's out of bounds, if they protest, if they say, no, you can't do that. You can't pour acid into a lake, right? I say, well, why not? We like to do this. It's a lot of fun. I could win some money. Well, no, it's wrong. Wait a second. I thought you said morality was relative. Maybe, it's wrong for you, but it's not wrong for me, right? And if you push the right hot button, you're going to help them see that they can't hold this consistently, okay? Here's another thing you can do. You can take something valuable. Take something valuable to show them that they are not a consistent moral relativist. So I did a speaking tour over in New Zealand, not last year, the year before. And I was speaking at this Christian school in New Zealand, but there was a number of skeptical students. And after my talk, they took a break, and over in New Zealand, they actually have like tea time. Like literal tea time. There was an hour break in school, and they were serving like tea and crumpets or whatever. I don't know, whatever things they're serving. But so these students have this tea break. So right after my talk, so the teacher said, hey, would you stay around and talk to students? I said, yeah, absolutely. So I stuck around, and after my talk, I had a number of students who came up to the stage and were chatting with me. We were engaging, and it was a mix of skeptical kids and some Christian kids. But there was one kid in particular very skeptical. And he was kept challenging. And so I was just engaging him in some really good conversation. But one of the things that he was arguing for was moral relativism. He said, morality is relative. And so we were in this dialogue, and I wanted to try and illustrate this for him. And I thought, here's a perfect situation, right? He is a Kiwi, and I am an American. So I looked at him, and I said, hey, do you have a wallet on you? And he said, yeah, why? I said, can I see it? And he said, okay. So he pulled his wallet out, and he gave it to me. And so I opened it up. I just pulled out, he had a little bit of cash. I pulled it out, put it in my pocket, and gave it back to him. And I just looked at him. And he said, you can't do that. I said, yeah, I just did. Didn't you see me take the money out? And I put it in my pocket. I did. He said, no, you can't. That's not right. I said, wait a second. What do you mean that's not right? He's like, well, that's my money. I said, I know. I said, but, taking people's money helps me get along in life. And so so he's starting to dawn on him what's going on here. So then he says, well, I can take it back. And now I was bigger than the kid. And so I said, go ahead and try, So he kind of reached in, I kind of pushed his arm away gently, and he's like, okay. He's like, well, you can't do that. And I said, yes, I actually can. I said, now are you telling me that in Kiwi culture, you guys think it's wrong to take people's money out of their wallets without their permission? He said, yes. I said, oh, okay, that's the problem. I said, I'm an American. I live in an American culture, and in America, we value taking people's money when it helps us get ahead in life. Right? And so at the end of that, and I was gracious in that situation, but it dawned upon him, like, this position is indefensible. Like, okay, I understand. Because it was personal. And now I was taking his money. It wasn't just abstract ideas about morality. Now, okay, let's live this out. You think morality is relative? Here's a great example. And so taking that helped to make the case to him that, no, there's objective morality. And this was great because we're coming from two different cultures. Right? Here's another thing that you can do. You give clear case examples. So I might ask someone, is there a difference between this man and this woman, morally speaking? Now think about it. If you say there's a difference between Hitler and Mother Teresa, morally speaking, you assume a moral standard. The only way you can tell the difference is if there's a moral standard that helps you to judge between those two examples. If morality is relative, if each culture decides, well, then that culture decided that was okay, and for whatever reason in her culture, that was okay in her culture. But you couldn't say one was better than the other. But this seems to be an example that's very clear. There is a huge moral difference between a Mother Teresa and a Hitler, okay? And so, these are different ways that we can expose the flaws of moral relativism. So our conclusion is that relativism is not a true view. It's not the right view of morality. It's a false view, not only because it fails, but because it also doesn't fit with what our basic knowledge of the world, our moral intuitions, our moral knowledge. And so here's what we find out. Morality is not something we determine. Morality is something we discover. Just like I don't determine the laws of gravity, it's not like we human beings create the laws of gravity, we simply discover it. It's part of the nature of reality. And in the same way, in a universe created by God, moral reality is just part of the nature of this world. And so we don't determine it, we discover it. Now, let me give you a couple resources here, and then I want to say some things in conclusion. Number one, if you want to make this case, if you want to help kind of strengthen your own views on this, go to our website, str.org, stand to reason, str.org. We have a ton of resources on this particular issue because this is a huge challenge. So go and look up resources on morality, on moral relativism, on objective morality, and we will help equip you with this kind of thinking. Go to str.org, connect with us online, all kinds of resources. But I also want to give you another really good resource. When you came in this morning, you should have gotten one of these cards. This card is your ticket to free training that we offer at Stand to Reason. And what we do 6 times a year is we have a newsletter called Solid Ground. We put out 6 times a year where we tackle difficult issues like this in the culture. And we help you to think through it carefully and intelligently. And we do more than just throw some Bible verses at it. We use Scripture, but we also use the minds that God has given us to carefully think through these issues so that you can engage a lost world with these things and do so intelligently. So if you are interested in that resource, all you have to do is let us know where you live so we can send them to you. So fill out that white card, and there's a place for your name and address, and if you want the email version, you can do that. For those of you who are interested in supporting my work financially, there's a little box for that. But you can take that card, fill that out, tear it off, and give it to us at the back table that's out in the lobby. And actually, in exchange for your card, we're going to give you a free resource called Jesus the Only Way that helps you see the biblical argument that Jesus is the only way to salvation. So I'll trade you. You give me the white card, I'll give you a resource card out there at the table. And then you will be signed up for free training materials on a regular basis. Because a conference like this is fantastic, but this should just be a start. And so we need to figure out ways to continue training ourselves and thinking carefully about these things and loving God with our minds. And so I would encourage you, sign up for Solid Ground. It's a fantastic resource. All right, now, what we've been able to show is that trying to rebuild our confidence that we can know morality. We can recognize certain objective moral truths. And like I said, not every objective moral truth is obvious, but we have at least a base, a foundation of objective moral truths. So then the question becomes, right, where do these kinds of things come from? Right? If you think about it, a moral truth is what we call mind independent. It means it's not dependent on any mind. It's not subjective. It's objective. It's immaterial, right? A moral value or a moral obligation is not a physical thing. You're not going to walk out the doors and trip over a moral law, right? It's a non-physical thing. It has to do with commands and authority in persons that seem to make sense of this. And we're getting to what philosophers call the grounding question. So here's the idea. Think about soil, right? Certain soil allows certain kind of plants to grow up out of it. If you don't have the right soil, you're not going to get certain plants, certain flowers. You got to have the right soil, the right ground. In the same way, what worldview gives you the ground or the soil in which objective morality grows out of, right? So in what worldview does objective morality make the most sense? It's called the grounding question. And here's a way to illustrate it. There's a couple of different ways to illustrate it, but let me give you one. Let's say I approach a friend and they're reading a newspaper, okay? They're reading a newspaper. Now, of course, if they're reading a newspaper, they're gonna have to be an older friend, right? Because young people don't read newspapers anymore. But let's say they're reading a newspaper and I walk up to them and I say, hey, what are you reading? Oh, I'm reading the New York Times. Oh, is there a particular article? Yeah, there's this really great article. It's a really great article about, this particular, political event. Oh, really? Well, who wrote it? Person looks at me and says, well, nobody wrote it. What do you mean nobody wrote it? You're reading it. Who wrote it? Now imagine my friend says to me, well, I don't believe in writers. I don't believe in writers, but I can still read the paper. Now think about that. Is that true? If you don't believe in writers, can you still read the paper? Yeah. If you don't believe in an author, you can still read the paper. All right? But you and I, now you're looking at me like, well, that's really weird. Of course it is. Of course it is, because we know that an article is this kind of thing that needs an author for its explanation, right? If you have an article, the best explanation for the existence of an article is an author. Now, you can read that article even if you don't believe in authors, but that doesn't tell us where the article comes from. In the same way, when it comes to morality, we don't want to make the mistake and say that if you don't believe in God, you can't be moral. If you don't believe in God, you can be moral. But the question we want to know is, if you think there are objective moral truths, where do they come from? Where do they come from? In fact, notice there's a very huge difference between the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948. This is a document that the United Nations produced that says this: all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Now, would we agree with that? I think so, right? It affirms the rights of human beings, but go back to the Declaration of Independence. What's the difference? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Do you see the difference? It's the grounding. In this document, we don't know where the rights come from. They're just a declaration that there are these rights. In this document, we have the rights, but it also grounds them. It shows us what's the origin of these rights. The origin is God. God is the best explanation for moral values and moral obligations and moral laws. Now think about it. Let's reason through this a little bit more. Why would we say that? We're not just saying, well, it must be God. No, we're reasoning to God. And here's an illustration to help us make sense of this. Imagine you're at your favorite Chinese restaurant. You just get done with your meal, and you're waiting for the fortune cookies. I don't know about your kids, but my kids always want to get the fortune cookies, right? So they get the fortune cookies. You open up their fortune cookies, and one of the fortunes you pull out says, "Get up and leave now." Now, how many of you immediately gather up your family and say, "Guys, the fortune cookie said it. I believe it. That settles it. Let's go," right? And you leave. Well, I would guess nobody, unless you're paranoid or something, right? You're not going to get up and leave now. You're going to be like, okay, that's really weird, but I'm not going to get up because a fortune cookie told me to get up. Now, let's change the scenario. Same command, but let's say you finish your meal at the Chinese restaurant. There's a lady sitting at the table next to you, and she says, "Get up and leave now." Do you get up and leave immediately because she said so? Probably not. I would hope not. You're probably going to ask her a question, right? You're going to say, "Why?" Or you might ask, "Who are you?" Right? Now, what if she says, "Well, I'm just another customer here, and I just want you to leave now"? You're not going to leave because she, as a customer, wants you to leave. "Sorry, ma'am, we're enjoying our meal. Please leave us alone." But imagine, okay, third scenario. She says, "Get up and leave now." You say, "Why?" She says, "Well, because I'm an undercover FBI agent. We're doing a drug sting on the owner of this restaurant. You better get up and leave now." Does that change things? Do you get up and leave? Yes. And now there's an obligation to leave. Now notice, it's the same command, whether it comes from the fortune cookie or whether it comes from a customer or whether it comes from the FBI agent. But in the first two cases, we don't feel any obligation to obey the command, where in the third instance, we do feel an obligation to obey the command. What's the difference between the first two situations and the third situation? Authority and personal authority. Think about it. There will never, ever be a time that a fortune cookie itself has the authority to command you, right? Inanimate objects can't offer commands and moral obligations. Only a personal authority. A personal authority. And so if we have moral laws and values and obligations that are non-physical, that must be backed up by a personal authority, that offer a way of goodness, what would explain such a thing? Let me show you a short little video that helps us to see how morality ends up being an argument for God's existence. All right, well, here, let me back that up.
Can you be good without God? Let's find out. Absolutely astounding. There you have it. Undeniable proof that you can be good without believing in God. But wait, the question isn't, can you be good without believing in God? The question is, can you be good without God? See, here's the problem. If there is no God, what basis remains for objective good or bad, right or wrong? If God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. And here's why. Without some objective reference point, we have no way of saying that something is really up or down. God's nature provides an objective reference point for moral values. It's the standard against which all actions and decisions are measured. But if there's no God, there's no objective reference point. All we're left with is one person's viewpoint, which is no more valid than anyone else's viewpoint. This kind of morality is subjective, not objective. It's like a preference for strawberry ice cream. The preference is in the subject, not the object. So it doesn't apply to other people. In the same way, subjective morality applies only to the subject. It's not valid or binding for anyone else. So, in a world without God, there can be no evil and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. God has expressed his moral nature to us as commands. These provide the basis for moral duties. For example, God's essential attribute of love is expressed in his command to love your neighbor as yourself. This command provides a foundation upon which we can affirm the objective goodness of generosity, self-sacrifice, and equality. And we can condemn as objectively evil greed, abuse, and discrimination. This raises a problem. Is something good just because God wills it, or does God will something because it is good? The answer is neither one. Rather, God wills something because he is good. God is the standard of moral values, just as a live musical performance is the standard for a high-fidelity recording.
Without your love.
The more a recording sounds like the original, the better it is. Likewise, the more closely a moral action conforms to God's nature, the better it is. But if atheism is true, there is no ultimate standard. So there can be no moral obligations or duties. Who or what lays such duties upon us? No one. Remember, for the atheist, humans are just accidents of nature, highly evolved animals. But animals have no moral obligations to one another. When a cat kills a mouse, it hasn't done anything morally wrong. The cat's just being a cat. If God doesn't exist, we should view human behavior in the same way. No action should be considered morally right or wrong. But the problem is, good and bad, right and wrong, do exist. Just as our sense experience convinces us that the physical world is objectively real, our moral experience convinces us that moral values are objectively real. Every time you say, "Hey, that's not fair, that's wrong, that's an injustice," you affirm your belief in the existence of objective morals. We're well aware that child abuse, racial discrimination, and terrorism are wrong for everybody, always. Is this just a personal preference or opinion? No. The man who says that it is morally acceptable to rape little children is just as mistaken as the man who says 2 + 2 = 5. What all this amounts to, then, is a moral argument for the existence of God. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. But objective moral values and duties do exist. Therefore, God exists. Atheism fails to provide a foundation for the moral reality every one of us experiences every day. In fact, the existence of objective morality points us directly to the existence of God.
There we go. We have a powerful argument for God's existence. In fact, you can, I think it's a great little video resource. William Lane Craig is a brilliant Christian philosopher and apologist. His organization, Reasonable Faith, has put this together. You can go to reasonablefaith.org/moral, and you can view that for yourself. And there's actually 3 other videos on there that give other arguments for God's existence. So it's a great little kind of summary of what we've just talked about, right? The best explanation for morality, where does morality come from? The best explanation that morality is from God. And now, think about moral guilt. Think about moral shame. Think about regret and these kinds of things. What makes sense of those kind of things? Right? The Christian worldview makes sense of things like moral guilt and shame. If you feel guilty, isn't it possible that you are guilty? Why is there a sense of moral guilt? Why is there regret? Why is there shame? Because there's an objective moral law that we have broken and we have violated. And that leaves us guilty in the sight of a morally perfect God or a holy God, right? Now think about it. For us, this whole argument, this whole discussion, I think leads us directly to the gospel. If you find humanity broken and messed up and sinful, right, is the theological term we use, if we are moral law breakers and we are guilty, well, guilt in a moral system requires some kind of justice or punishment. And so what's the solution to that guilt? The solution is not denial. In fact, relativism is a form of moral denial, isn't it? If morality turns out to be relative, I have no obligations. That's denial. No, what is the solution to guilt? If you are truly and objectively guilty, the solution to guilt is not denial. The solution to guilt is forgiveness. You see how the Christian worldview makes sense of this? And actually offers hope. We're in this hopeless situation where we're lawbreakers, we deserve God's justice, and yet God, in his love and mercy, says, I am going to take care of that problem because I love my creatures so much. And he pays our moral guilt on the cross. And you see how you actually need a view of objective morality even to make sense of the cross. And so we need to have these kind of conversations in our culture and let this point to the solution to guilt, and that is the cross of Jesus Christ. That's why we offer hope to the world. And not only that, not only do we offer the hope of salvation, we offer the hope of new life as well. Think about it. Oftentimes, the Christian church is characterized by the word no. And we're really good at saying, no, 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 no. God says no to this. God says no to that. God says no to this. And certainly that's part of the story, right? God gives us moral laws that we're to obey. But that's not the entire story. In fact, sometimes I think when we communicate things this way, we miscommunicate really the beauty of God's story. Right? And so you have, things like this in our culture, these kinds of slogans. I tried to be good, but I got bored, right? Being good, being moral is the boring thing to do. If I want to have an exciting, fun life, well, then I don't give in to the no's. But we want to help people see that actually every no is really a yes. So when I think about it, if I want coffee, I will drive past McDonald's. I will say no to McDonald's coffee. I will say no to 7-Eleven coffee because eventually I want to say yes to Starbucks or by my house in Southern California, Portola, okay? I'm gonna say no to these other things because I ultimately wanna say yes to something better and richer and deeper and darker. That Portola cup of coffee, right? Well, in the same way, that helps us to understand the reasons behind God's moral law. So when we're talking to our young people about sexuality, we can't just give them the no's. Let's also give them the yes. I want my young people to say no to sex before marriage because I want them to say yes to God's beautiful design for intimacy within marriage. See, it's not just no, God wants to take away all your fun. No, it's that God is a good God who gives us good gifts. And when we follow his moral path, it's so much richer and deeper and fulfilling. And so we need to paint that beautiful picture for the world as well. We're not just running out there saying no. There's a time and place for that. But we're also painting a vision of the moral life. A beautiful moral life that's captured, I think, by the scriptures. Of course, the scriptures talk about this in terms of living in righteousness. And here is how the psalmist captures this vision. Psalm 1, blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, or stand in the way of sinners, or sit in the seat of mockers, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. He is like a tree planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in season, and whose leaf does not wither. Whatever he does prospers. That's a positive picture of righteousness. And not only do we need to say that, then we need to live that and let the people around us see us as trees planted by streams of water so that they are also wooed to the goodness of God. Amen? Let's pray. God, thank you for your moral truth. Thank you for giving us the ability to know your moral truth. And I pray that we as a church would recapture the beautiful vision of morality and righteousness that you have revealed to us in the scripture. Help us, Lord, to know our arguments. Help us to know the truth well so we can articulate it intelligently. But also, Lord, help us to live it out well so that our lives are a light to this world. And we pray that you would help us to be that light, that city on a hill that shows our world the way forward in righteousness, and that we constantly point to you through the goodness that they see in our lives. Thank you, Lord. Sanctify us. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Maven exists to help the next generation know truth, pursue goodness, and create beauty for the cause of Christ. To find out more, check out maventruth.com.